Straight ahead on Law and Crime Daily. Should the Derek Chauvin trial jury be sequestered?
There's civil unrest, and maybe some of the jurors did hear about that.
The shocking body cam video of a police officer shooting and killing a 20-year-old man just miles from the Minneapolis courthouse. What the Brooklyn Center police chief is saying about the Daunte Wright case.
This was an accidental discharge that resulted in the tragic death of Mr. Wright.
Our legal analysis on whether this case could have an impact on the Chauvin trial. Plus, the continuing coverage of our investigation into the man seen in the car with George Floyd on the day he died. Why Maurice Hall is in jail on sex trafficking charges, and will Chauvin's defense call him to testify?
He describes that they had to try to shake Mr. Floyd awake several times.
Law and Crime Daily.
Is Terri Austin. Week 3 of testimony in the high-profile trial. Now, the plan is to sequester the jury once they start deliberating. But, Brian, the defense is hoping to change that, right?
That's right, Jesse. Just about 10 miles from here in Brooklyn Center, a young man was shot and killed by a police officer. Now, that's a separate city and a separate police department, but that case seems to have implications here. The defense filed a motion to sequester the jury Monday morning. Attorney Eric Nelson says at least one juror lives in Brooklyn Center and others have connections to the city. He was concerned civil unrest there might pressure jurors to vote to not convict because they do not want civil unrest in Minneapolis. Prosecutors say it's a different case and different department, so sequestering the jury wouldn't be appropriate. Judge Cahill denied the motion and explained why he did so.
The jurors all are aware and were concerned about their safety because of what happened in May of 2020, the civil unrest that followed there. Not a big surprise that there's now civil unrest in response to this case, but I don't think that should heighten the jurors' concern. I think it's probably the same as it was before. They all have a concern that they expressed and were very honest about. And so I'm not going to sequester them. We'll sequester them on Monday when we anticipate doing closings.
So, Brian, Judge Cahill says that the jury won't be sequestered during testimony, but they will be after closing arguments, which are anticipated for next Monday. What is that going to look like?
Yeah, so that's probably going to look like is they'll come in as they have been throughout the pendency, both of the opening statements and all the way through the testimony we heard so far. But the judge is giving us an indication that when the closing arguments begin sometime next week, as he pointed out, that they're going to be sequestered for that as well as jury deliberation. So they'll most likely be posted up somewhere in a hotel here and kept away from the public eye and any kind of scrutiny.
All right, thanks, Brian. Day 11 of testimony began with Dr. Jonathan Rich, a cardiologist called as an expert by the state. Now, Rich said this is his first time testifying in court.
After reviewing all of the facts and evidence of the case, I can state with a high degree of medical certainty that George Floyd did not die from a primary cardiac event, and he did not die from a drug overdose.
Did Mr. Floyd have any diagnosis of heart disease while he was still alive?
No, he did not.
And did you see at some point in you watching the video that Mr. Floyd went into cardiopulmonary arrest?
Eventually, yes, I did. You could see, at least I could see, his speech starting to become less forceful, his muscle movements becoming weaker, until, of course, eventually his speech became absent. Eventually, his muscle movements were absent. And then, as we later discovered by the heart rhythm, he was in a PEA, cardiopulmonary arrest.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Floyd's death was preventable?
Yes, I believe that Mr. George Floyd's death was absolutely preventable.
Now, the county's chief medical examiner who performed the autopsy on George Floyd previously testified that Floyd had underlying heart disease, including narrowing of arteries. Now, on cross-examination, Dr. Andrew Baker said that those factors played a role in his death.
He had 75% narrowing of the first diagonal branch of his left anterior descending coronary artery, and then in his right coronary artery, which in most people is the second largest of the three, he had 90% proximal narrowing.
And what do forensic pathologists generally consider to be enough narrowing of the arteries to cause a sudden death?
We usually look to 75% greater as capable of causing sudden death.
And so in your opinion, both the heart disease as well as the history of hypertension and the drugs that were in his system played a role in Mr. Floyd's death?
In my opinion, yes.
Okay, let's break it down. Brian, the cardiologist said that Floyd's heart was normal. That's what it appeared to say. But the medical examiner said that he had this underlying heart disease. How does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think what the cardiologist is basically saying is that he's seen hearts like this before. It's not strange, unfortunately, in America or North America, for someone to have a heart that is a little bit larger. I'm 6'4", my heart's a little bit larger as well than the average person because, surprise, surprise, I'm a little bit taller than the average person, but also to see that they're reblocking in the heart. And the interesting part about what this witness testified to was actually when there's partial blockage in one part of the heart is this phenomenal muscle that will help to correct it and ensure that that flow works in other ways as well.
Now, Terry, here's the other thing, because on cross-examination, Nelson asked Dr. Baker about his conversation with the Hennepin County attorneys after the death of George Floyd, but before Dr. Baker viewed the video. So did it seem to you that Dr. Baker's opinions may have changed after he viewed the video?
I think it did, Jesse. If you recall, for the statements he made to the Hennepin County attorney, he was basically saying there was no evidence of asphyxiation. He said that the heart condition was not really, or was a contributing factor. He basically said that the level of fentanyl really could have caused the death of someone else, and that if Floyd had been home alone, the diagnosis could have been a fentanyl overdose. But we saw on the direct examination and even on the cross-examination that he's basically backing away from that. And I do believe it was because he did view the video and he did have a slight change of opinion as to the cause of death. And ultimately, he said it was because of this law enforcement subdural restraint and neck compression.
All right, interesting. And see how the prosecution ties it all together. Still ahead on Law and Crime Daily, the police shooting of a man nearby to the Chauvin trial and the newly released body cam video. But first, will the man seen in the car with George Floyd testify? Where Maurice Hall has been in jail since jury selection, and much more that you need to know next. Welcome back, everybody. The man who was in George Floyd's SUV when he was approached by police last May appears in court on sex trafficking charges. Law and Crime's Angenette Levy's here with what happened in Maurice Hall's latest court appearance. Angenette?
Jesse, Maurice Hall has already posted bail in his 4 Hennepin County cases, but now he has to post even more cash in a case from another county. He's not very happy about it, as arguments about whether or not he'll testify in the Chauvin trial continue.
We was getting a ride, I just got my phone fixed.
Shawanda Hill and Maurice Hall were in the SUV with George Floyd as police approached last May. Derek Chauvin's attorney says he needs the jury to hear Hall's testimony about what happened that day, or portions of a 90-minute interview he had with state investigators.
He freely answered the agent's questions about where he and Mr. Floyd spent the day, what their behaviors were, where they went, the things that they did earlier in the day, and specifically how he appeared physically, what his demeanor was.
Nelson says Hall fled to Texas right after Floyd died. Investigators found him a week later. At that time, Nelson and prosecutors say Hall made incriminating statements when interviewed. Hall wants to invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. His attorney said in court last week he could put himself at risk for being charged with third-degree murder if he gave drugs to George Floyd. Prosecutors say he could also be charged with counterfeiting.
There's a lot about Mr. Hall's statement that is self-serving and unreliable.
Prosecutors say Hall's interview with investigators is hearsay and doesn't meet exceptions to that rule.
He denies giving any pills to Mr. Floyd, denies that he had pills. We know a lot of that is not, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that's not true.
Maurice Hall is in a lot of hot water legally. He has felony cases pending in Hennepin County, and in Redwood County, he's facing charges of solicitation, sex trafficking in the second degree, promoting prostitution, and 2 counts of controlled substance crimes involving methamphetamine, heroin, fentanyl, tramadol, and other drugs. In court on those charges, the judge told Hall he'd have to post $2,500 in cash to get out of jail, to which Hall responded, "That's effing nuts, bro." Meanwhile, prosecutors in the Chauvin trial have not given Hall immunity to testify. Experts say Hall's testimony only benefits the defense.
We were limiting those questions to just in the car.
Correct.
Judge Cahill took a few hours to mull this issue, and he decided that it would not be proper for the jury to see that police interview or to hear about it. He doesn't want the jurors to see that. He said it's just not admissible. Cahill also said that the state is not required to give a reason as to why they won't give Maurice Hall immunity. Jesse?
All right, thanks, Angenette. Now, Brian, if Maurice Hall takes the stand and invokes his Fifth Amendment right, how will this move the case one way or the other?
I'm not quite sure this really helps, because the way I'm looking at it down the line as a public defender in Brooklyn, if he testifies, he's going to invoke the Fifth Amendment for some very crucial testimony. And of course, as Eric Nelson should, he should point out that invoking that right is keeping away some information. But if Derek Chauvin himself doesn't testify and he does the exact same thing, I can see this backfiring on him. So it might be short-term gains, but it could be a long-term loss for the defense, depending on how this plays out.
Terri, why do you think Chauvin's attorney is arguing to have Maurice Hall testify? Does he really need his testimony when we already heard the testimony of Courtney Ross, the George Floyd's girlfriend, who confirmed that George Floyd used drugs?
He does not need that testimony. It seems to me that it's redundant. As you said, we heard Courtney Ross already talk about the fact that George Floyd took opioids, took fentanyl, and we don't need to hear Maurice Hall talk about that. I think that what the defense is trying to do is paint a picture that these individuals were all using drugs and they were addicts, and he's trying to literally victimize the victim. And I think one of the things the judge said made a lot of sense. He said that Hall's statements are not necessary for a complete defense. So in the judge's opinion, we already have all that we need to defend Chauvin, and those statements by Hall are not necessary.
Now, Angenette, it's my understanding that Hall did admit to at least one crime in that interview with BCA agents. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, Jesse, he actually admitted, according to Eric Nelson and the prosecutors, they've all seen this interview and read the transcripts, that he possessed counterfeit bills that day. Now, that's at the heart of this case. That is what got the ball rolling here. That's what started the police call, is that $20 bill that was believed to be counterfeit. And they believe he could face some charges for that. He could also potentially face that third-degree murder charge should the prosecution decide to pursue that. But at this point, they are saying that that didn't cause his death, that wasn't part of it. So we'll just have to wait and see. But he did deny giving George Floyd drugs in that car that day. So it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out.
Important person in a complicated story. Coming up on Law and Crime Daily, George Floyd's brother testified. Police in Minnesota have released body cam video showing the fatal shooting of a man over the weekend, which has sparked protests. Law and Crime's Kim Johnson is in Minneapolis and has the latest. Kim?
Jesse, as if tensions couldn't get any higher during Derek Chauvin's murder trial here in Minneapolis, they have, and by a lot. Another death of a black man in the hands of police, this time in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, a town that shares a border with Minneapolis and is not far from here, just miles away from the courthouse. We want to warn you that the body-worn camera footage is graphic. It shows an officer fatally shooting 20-year-old Daunte Wright during a traffic stop for expired tabs. During a press conference, Brooklyn Center Police Chief Tim Gannon says that he believes the shooting was accidental.
Okay.
During this encounter, however, the officer drew their handgun instead of their taser. As I watched the video and listened to the officer's commands, it is my belief that the officer had the intention to deploy their taser, but instead shot Mr. Wright with a single bullet.
Now, the officer is now on administrative duty, but the mayor of Brooklyn Center says he thinks the officer should be fired. Just as in former Officer Chauvin's case, the State Bureau of Criminal Apprehension will now take over the investigation. Now, immediately after this shooting, peaceful protests, some of them did turn violent, and some businesses here were looted. In light of that, Chauvin's defense team has asked the judge to sequester the jury for any possible tainting or exposure, and the judge has denied that request, arguing that the two cases are completely separate. Jesse.
And Kim, have you seen any protests around the courthouse specifically?
Well, in light of this shooting, no, not near the courthouse yet. However, I suspect that could change, especially since the defense is about to take over and present its case and its arguments. I have already seen previous protesters here around the courthouse specifically calling out defense attorney Eric Nelson, some of the arguments that he has made, and they have not been happy with that. So I suspect the more we hear from Nelson and his arguments, we could see more protesters here around the courthouse in downtown Minneapolis.
Pretty incredible. Stay safe, Kim. Thank you. When we come back into the courtroom for the Derek Chauvin. Prosecutors in the Derek Chauvin trial called George Floyd's brother to the stand as part of a Minnesota law known as Spark of Life, testimony intended to humanize Floyd to the jurors.
He used to make the best banana mayonnaise sandwiches, and he used to make syrup sandwiches. Because George couldn't cook, he couldn't boil water. He loved sports, so he always wanted to be the best. That's my mother. She's no longer with us right now, but that's my oldest brother, George. I miss both of them. They are. I was married. In May 24th, I got married. And my brother was killed May 25th. And my mom died on May 30th. So it's like a bittersweet month because I'm supposed to be happy when that month comes.
Prosecutors went on to ask him more about their mother and the impact her death had on their lives.
He was a big mama's boy. I cry a lot, but George, he loved his mom. He will always just be up under her. And, you know, every mother loves all of her kids, but it was so unique how they were with each other. He showed us, like, how to treat our mom and how to respect our mom. He loved her so dearly. When we went to the funeral, it's just, George just sat there at the casket over and over again. He would just say, "Mama, Mama," over and over again. And I didn't know what to tell him because I was in pain too. We all were hurting.
Brian, the defense didn't cross-examine Philonise Floyd, and why do you think that was?
I think it was two things. It was a strategic move. I think everyone kind of felt Philonise Floyd's testimony, especially this mama's boy. I think everyone kind of understands the mama's boy kind of just feeling, and especially if you are one. And then the other thing is from a legal standpoint, Mr. Floyd, or Philonise Floyd, didn't open the door to any impermissible testimony. If he had said George Floyd is a gentle giant or a peaceful person, you would have seen Eric Nelson jump on that and rebut that with their own evidence. And so because there was no real opening there, and this is not a witness you want to cross-examine, I think Nelson did the right move here.
Terry, the prosecution called Philonise Floyd, as I said, as a spark of life witness, this legal definition. Do you think he was effective for that strategy?
I do think he was effective, although I will say I think that the prosecution could have gone into a little bit more detail. I know you have to be careful so you don't open the door for the cross-examination, but he talked about the fact that they came from an underprivileged area, the fact that he made these sandwiches for all of the siblings, and the fact that George Floyd was very close to his mother. So I think the jury felt that. What he could have done also is to use Philonise Floyd as a witness to talk about what is George like now? What are his children like? What kind of father is he? So the jury could get a better feel for the type of person he was right before he died. So I do think there was a little bit more, but I definitely think that for the jury, George Floyd's personality was humanized, at least to a certain extent.
And it's important to have these spark of life witnesses because we've heard George Floyd in a headline, as a statistic, as just a symbol. But to really understand who he was on a day in, day out basis, it gives the jurors a different perspective that might not.